What does a public school have in common with a lighthouse? Their use is free, unlimited, and available to all. Using the school or the lighthouse does not reduce its availability. Everyone can use either without cost, without limit, or without qualifying. Together we have to decide which things are held in common and provided in abundance, and which things are placed in the private, competitive pool. This is a difficult choice and affects the balance between what we manage individually and what we manage in community. As so often in life, one can trade independence for security. If, for example, we tax ourselves to provide health care, we all pay for this service. We give up part of our economic independence. In return, we achieve health security. Medicare is an invaluable support in one's personal and family life. The benefit of the lighthouse is less personal and tangible. Lighthouses save lives and property and make safer transportation available. We prosper from the increased trade and transit. Public schools build community. They create society. All types of schools can teach the 3 R's, but only the public school brings all description of children together. They learn to be together. They learn to work together. They learn from their differences. Public schools are the foundation of a multicultural society. Are we keeping our public schools free, unlimited, and available to all? If we are, our future is more secure. Our rising generations working together will move society forward in community. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters. Visit our archive and see past programs at youreducationmatters.ca. Dr. Westheimer, I'd like to talk with you a bit about the labor rights of teachers and the place of teachers as a profession in our societies here in North America and what your observations are.
It's such a timely question because we're living, especially with our neighbors to the south, but here as well, in this time of immense aggression towards teachers. And it's amazing in the wake of what happened on Wall Street that we could have our anger redirected from, the brokers and financiers who've taken apart and hurt so many people to teachers who are making $40,000 and $50,000 and $60,000 a year. But that animosity is there, and I think that people need to understand that teacher unions and unions in general, with all their flaws, are the most important counterweight that we have in this point in time to an agenda that would push for larger class sizes, less money to education, in more impoverished schools, to all kinds of things that would not be in the public interest. And teachers are professionals who in the classroom know what is best for their kids. Now, are there some bad teachers? Of course there are bad teachers. There's, bad people in every profession, right? But on the whole, people went into teaching often when they could have done much more lucrative professions, and they went in because what they have at heart is the interests of the children that they work with. The saying, what's good for teachers is good for students, shouldn't be ignored, right? Teachers fight for better working conditions because they know that it's in those working conditions that they can properly educate our children. And I think that the unions and the other institutions that represent our teachers are a critically important counterweight to some of the many other detrimental forces that are at work against teachers in schools today.
Thank you very much. In his new book, The Social Conquest of Earth, renowned evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson argues for what he calls group selection. By this he means that although human beings' evolution has long been seen as natural selection in the context of individual versus individual, or kinship group versus kinship group, there is a more accurate way to understand the process. Wilson argues that the highest level of social organization, what he calls eusociality, good sociality, is built on several traits we find in humans. These include cooperativeness and empathy. Wilson's vision is that humanity could make of this earth a home for all humanity, living in peace and prosperity, And the key is community, cooperation. Seeing humanity all together as a group instead of envisioning ourselves in competing tribes or as selfish individuals. Politically, social democracy captures this ideal, that all people would achieve a type of equality, not equality of specific property, but equality of human dignity. Such equality of dignity depends on the common guarantee for all people of the necessities of life, including, of course, healthcare. And how does education fit in? Access to education must truly be universal and not constrained by wealth or status. The content of education must emphasize a vision of this eusocial world, a multicultural society that aspires to global inclusiveness and the creation of human community. Social insects, in Wilson's view, offer us a vision of social cooperation, but only humanity can imagine our entire species as one group. Canada's commitment to multiculturalism is a national step in this direction. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters. Visit our archive and see past programs at youreducationmatters.ca. Dr. Carter, I'd like to talk with you about our vision of education as professional educators and our sense of what the purposes of education are. For many people, it's economic. For other people, it's self-realization or fulfillment. Historically, it could be for citizenship. Given your research and your exposure to children and their parents, what do you think are the competing visions of education we have in society?
I think the most prevalent vision we have today is one that actually fosters and challenges us, even though it's one that we think is the one to have. And that is the perspective that education is a private good, and it's just about making sure each of our children is learned, that the right amount of knowledge is imparted so that they can go on and just become productive economic actors and live the whatever country dream it may be. And what that entails is a very individualistic approach that in many ways minimizes the degree to which we think about the other. And so I think it really threatens the very societies that we say we espoused in terms of our values, whether living in democratic, healthy, whole, just, equal societies. And many times the way we approach education, though, is about competing against one another as opposed to cooperating with one another. And I also think the other thing is that we think education is about not thinking about its relationship to the other aspects of society. It's an ecological problem that we suffer from. When there is poverty, when there is no health care. I mean, in this country, obviously, you take an approach that's very different from what we do in the U.S., but we're fighting about whether or not all citizens should have health care in the United States. These things are related. When children come to school sick, it's hard for them to be educated. When they come to school poor and hungry, it's hard for them to concentrate. And if we don't think about those things, about how it is, well, I'm just going to go to the best school for my children. I don't want to pay a certain amount of taxes because that's too much for my pocket, and I'm thinking about my family and my well-being, then that does have an impact on what about the rest of society. And if we all can't be brought along and only a few of us are going to be brought along, then we actually undermine the very values of justice. And equity and equality that I think. So for me, it's about trying to create an egalitarian just society.
It sounds like you're talking about social democracy rather than liberalism or other schools of thought in politics.
I hesitate to put myself in any kind of box, but I certainly espouse the social democratic vision, very much so. And it's not something that we actually espouse in the United States. It's really right now about competition and choice. Yes.
You know, I think when people believe the schools should aim at developing an economic being, a successful economic player out of the student, they're aiming too low. Because I think that if your target is a self-realized person, to use Jungian language, which I like, that person will also be a community member because that's part of, you'll be a social person, that's part of being a self-realized person, and you certainly will be an economic player and a valuable person economically. You would want to be as a part of your sense of being in the community and out of your sense of responsibility and justice to pull your own weight in the world. So to say that the schools are there to provide for economic well-being of people, just to me, is not the inclusive way to look at education.
And I would absolutely agree. And I would suspect that if we don't continue to do this, that we'll see inequality around the world get even greater. And it will affect, inequality affects us all, whether we believe it or not, even if we have the material resources. It will come back to bite us in many ways.
I think it affects us more deeply than we know.
Yes.
And when I spend time in the United States now and see some of the deprivation that goes on, particularly because of health care, it makes me upset, and it makes me want to come back here, where I feel that human dignity is preserved in that aspect of life, which is a very fundamental aspect of life.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I know that children have said to me, and I'll say this quote, there's a young man named Judah who attended a very affluent high school in one of my studies, but he comes from a very poor background. And he said to me, if we want to reduce the academic gap in this country, then we must reduce the empathy gap. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was so incisive for a child, a 15-year-old, to say, is that if we don't care about one another, if we don't figure out how to cooperate, if we don't subscribe to a more expansive way of understanding what the role of schooling and education are, then what we'll have is people just trying to get up on one another. Sure, good schools will provide the human capital. They'll inculcate that and instill that and impart that in some ways, develop that for students, but it won't create the kind of society that we say we want in terms of fairness and justice and equality for all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carter.
Thank you.
Welcome to Your Education Matters. Here you will find in-depth discussions about all levels of education presented by persons knowledgeable about the field. Here are data and analyses you have been looking for to help make your educational decisions. Benjamin Levin is Professor and Canada Research Chair in Educational Leadership and Policy at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto. His career is about half as an academic and half as a senior provincial civil servant. Dr. Levin is a native of the city of Winnipeg who holds a BA from the University of Manitoba, a master's from Harvard University, and a PhD from OISE. As a civil servant, Ben Levin served as Deputy Minister for Education for the province of Ontario for approximately 4 years, most recently in 2008-09. Earlier, he was Deputy Minister of Advanced Education and Deputy Minister of Education, Training, and Youth for the province of Manitoba. As an academic, he has published 7 books, including 2 just out, More High School Graduates and Breaking Barriers, and more than 200 articles on education while studying and speaking on education issues around the world. His current interests are in large-scale change, poverty and inequity, improving high schools, and finding better ways to connect research to policy and practice in education. We are pleased to welcome Professor Ben Levin to Your Education Matters. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters. Dr. Levin, you've written about and you've been active in your political life with teacher professionalism, and that's a very live issue here in British Columbia. I would like you to talk some about teachers as professionals and help us understand how we can relate to them in that way.
Sure. I think there's a couple of important things about that, but I think we're at a critical juncture here where teachers collectively have the opportunity to say we do have a professional status that we own as a profession, which is what every other profession does. And that would mean teachers collectively saying there's some things we know about good teaching practice that all teachers do, because that's what it means to be a teacher. That's what every profession is about. In teaching, we've had this idea that every teacher has their own way, every school has its own way, and to me that's incommensurate with the notion of professionalism. This isn't to say we impose practices on teachers. Teachers should own that practice themselves. And of course, there are lots of areas in which there's still lots of room for autonomy and discretion based on professional knowledge. But I think it's really incumbent on us to say that there is a body of knowledge, and this is where I come back to our earlier discussion of research. There is a body of knowledge about good teaching practice, and we as professionals expect every teacher to embody that knowledge in their daily work, because that's what it means to be a teacher. I think that's one of the ways teachers would be more successful in claiming that kind of professional status vis-a-vis the public in the way that other professions do. But we are not there yet in education.
Well, I suppose some of that comes to teacher education, which was my field. Do you feel that in the provinces you're familiar with, teacher education is doing its part along those lines?
No, I'd have to say, and for the same reason, because in teacher education, we're still of the view that if we have 3 different people teaching our new teachers how to read, they could teach them in 3 completely different ways, and that's okay. Well, you know, we wouldn't teach people how to do surgery in 3 different ways. There is a right way to do it that we teach everybody. So I do think that extends into teacher education, but past that. And it's also embodied in the idea of teachers as people who understand the importance of research, care about research, and are always interested in what new findings have to say about their practice.
There's some kind of a balance we're looking to strike between leaving autonomy for the teacher to function as a professional does, and also respecting the standards of the field and the standards that society is setting for us.
Yes, although I'd put it a little differently, because I think the real autonomy comes from the professional skill and knowledge. It's when you have a body of professional knowledge that you are able to be autonomous in understanding how you can apply that in different situations with different kids in different subject areas. If you don't have skill and knowledge, there's nothing to be autonomous about.
Do you think any province or accrediting body has done a good job of collecting the sorts of core knowledge that you believe teachers should put into practice? I mean, several years ago, for example, InTask worked on this. NCATE is a major accrediting body. Where would we go to find that core knowledge?
I think we'd have to look at examples of other professions. Now, one thing is that in education, we didn't have that core knowledge till recently, because it's only in the last couple of decades that we've had enough research evidence to be able to say much about good practice. But if you take ideas now like formative assessment or effective feedback or building on students' prior knowledge, these are now well grounded in research, and these are things that I think the teaching profession should say, this is what it means to be a teacher. Teachers do that. Of course, the way you use formative assessment is going to look different depending on the kids, the subject. Lots of room for autonomy and creativity around that. What there isn't room for is anyone say, I don't believe in formative assessment.
Well, in the United States, we try to address this through professional accreditation, especially NCATE, but Canada doesn't participate in that kind of a model.
Right.
So how would we implement?
I think this should come from the professional licensing bodies. I think this is how it happens in other professions. You know, in nursing, which is fairly analogous to teaching in many ways, because it's a mass occupation and people work as employees. In nursing, when there are new procedures, the nursing professional bodies issue clinical guidelines to nurses saying, we used to do it this way, but now we're going to do it that way. And of course the pickup isn't universal, but every nurse respects professional guidelines. I don't know of anybody that issues clinical guidelines for teachers in that way. And that's where I think we need to go.
Is there a federal element to this, or would this be done province by province?
Well, in my view, it should be owned by teachers themselves, and then it could be done nationally through the teachers' federations or the professional bodies that license teachers. Because of the way we organize Education Canada, we're not going to have a national licensing body, but we could have a national agreement on sharing those kinds of things that I think would mean we wouldn't have to do it all over and over in every province the way we do now.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. Welcome to Your Education Matters. Here you will find in-depth discussions about all levels of education, presented by persons knowledgeable about the field. Here are data and analyses you've been looking for to help make your educational decisions. Andy Hargreaves is the Thomas Moore Brennan Chair in the Lynch School of Education at Boston College. The mission of the chair is to promote social justice and connect theory and practice in education. Professor Hargreaves taught primary school and lectured in several English universities, including Oxford. After moving to Canada, he was co-founder and director of the International Centre for Educational Change at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. In 2010, Professor Hargreaves was awarded an honorary doctorate from Scandinavia's oldest university, Uppsala. He has received the Whitworth Award for Outstanding Contributions to Educational Research in Canada, was awarded a writing residency by the Rockefeller Foundation in order to write, teaching in the Knowledge Society, and is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in the UK. Professor Hargreaves' most recent books are Professional Capital, Sustainable Leadership, Change Wars, and the Fourth Way. His current research is on successful educational change strategies in high-performing school districts and organizations. We are pleased to welcome Professor Andrew Hargreaves to Your Education Matters. Thank you for thinking about Your Education Matters. Dr. Hargreaves, in British Columbia, the principle of competition has been introduced into education in many ways. School districts compete against each other for students. Schools within a district compete with each other. There's a desire to introduce the principle of competition in salaries, if it were possible, through merit pay. What do you think of this notion of competition as a way to drive reform in public schools?
It is what my colleague Michael Fullan would call a wrong driver in terms of a prime directive of what will raise achievement, increase effort, and produce better results. However, we tend to divide ideologically in terms of whether we like competition or whether we like collaboration. And one group will mainly vote for one set of people most of the time, and the other will mainly vote for another set of people most of the time. A study that we've finished a little while ago on what will be my next book with a colleague, Alma Harris, is, and you can find this on my website, worldwideweb.andyhargreaves.com, is a study of high performance in 20 organizations in business, sport, and education. One of the sporting organizations is actually the Vancouver Giants. So not the Canucks, but the Vancouver Giants hockey team. And one of the things we learned from studying not just the high-performing schools, but the high-performing businesses and sports teams, is that they all in some ways combine competition with collaboration. The competition, apart from the obvious place, which is on the ice or on the field, is not cutthroat win-lose. And even when there is intense competition at the point of performance, off the field or off the ice, there's intense collaboration. So, for instance, a soccer team that we looked at in England is a ruthless competitor with another team just 7 miles away on the field. Off the field, they share the same community in common. So they've been working with a big government grant around issues of anti-racism, community development, related to football, to soccer, within the entire community. There's a beer company in the United States, a micro beer company, that has produced a joint beer with its major competitor because they have a shared passion for alternative beer. Cricket Australia, which is one of the leading cricket nations in the world, receives 70% of its funding through global media from India, which is its major competitor. So it invests heavily in community development and political stability within India, because actually they want the competition to be close, to be tight, to be something that people will watch. And the schools that we've looked at in England, but this is also true of Finland and other places too, even when, as in England, they are in a competitive relationship, they network and they collaborate and they share expertise around many, many other areas. If one school falls, the other schools will rally round to lift it up, or to lift it up over time. And even as countries, in Singapore, what people tell us over and over again, and think about this if you're a school, they say, we give away our best ideas to other people. Because if other people now have our best ideas, it makes us have to keep innovating and keep moving ahead ourselves. So I'm not against competition, but I think friendly rivalry is an excellent thing. But systems that are win-lose, cutthroat, live or die, and prevent people sharing their expertise and learning for the sake of the community or the province are a dire direction. The local district, the local community, the local democracy is extremely important. And if that sounds trite, in America, in England, in Sweden, local democracy is being removed. There's provincial, the equivalent of a provincial government, and then lots of fragmented individual schools. But nothing, these are people's children that they have in common. It's the future of their community. So maintaining and strengthening rather than weakening local democracy. The local democracy is the most important thing in places like Finland, not national democracy. It's the municipality where everything really matters. So a second policy area is how do you strengthen that, keep people engaged. A third is, and BC has been very good at this in lots of ways, is how you network schools with each other, how schools can support schools. We've tended to have that a little bit as merely sharing good practice, or to be unkind, drooling over each other's dioramas in a kind of ecstasy of saccharine celebration. That's very uncritical, and what we can do to focus that a little bit more through these things called professional learning communities is really for some schools to acknowledge that actually some schools do things better than other schools, and they need to acknowledge that and actually have helping relationships, not merely sharing relationships. And the same is true with teachers in a school as well. So keep the networks, keep the sharing, but be a little un-Canadian in actually acknowledging openly that some of us are better at some things than the others of us are, and we need to find ways of not merely sharing expertise, but also specifically helping one another to benefit the students that we serve together.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.